Heidi-ho, students! Today we are working on lesson 3 from chapter 6. So in our green math books, we are open to 262. Today's learning target is going to say, I can compare rational numbers on a number line. So reminding you about rational numbers, we're going to be getting into fractions and decimals on a number line today. So let's get our learning target down first. I can compare, sorry about the handwriting there, rational numbers on a number line. So we're working with positive and negative numbers today. We're also working with fractions and decimals on a number line today. So with that said, we'll go ahead and just get right to our examples. So I know a lot of you aren't huge fans of fractions and decimals, but it is important to know the order of those on a number line and not just positive numbers. So example 1 is all about graphing negative fractions and decimals. So they want us to graph each number and its opposite. So we're going to make graphs. So we're going to graph each number. Whoops, forgot the N there. Number and its opposite. And remember, we learned what opposites were from lesson 1 from this chapter. So we have A, which is giving us 3/4, and they want us to graph that in a number line with its opposite. So let's make a number line. I tend to go to horizontal number lines that move from right to left, but if you wanted to make a vertical number line, you could. So I'm going to be graphing the positive version of 3/4 and then the opposite, which would be the negative version of 3/4. So I'm going to make this line be my 0. And then you have the option when you create your own number line to decide what each line is going to be worth. So on this particular number line, since we're graphing a fraction, I'm going to put my tick marks, but not have them represent wholes. I'm going to have them represent halves. So this is going to be worth 1/2. Then this is going to be worth 1. Then this one would be 1.5. Then this one would be worth 2, and so on. And then I'll go ahead and label the left side the same way, but with negatives. -1/2. Then we have -1/2. Then we have -1.5. And then we have -2. So if I'm going to plot 3/4 on my number line, here's where 1/2 would be. If I have a half of a pizza versus 3/4 of a pizza, I would have more pizza if I had 3/4 of it. So my dot is going to be bigger than 1/2. So it's going to be right up in this area. So you're going to make a dot in this area, and you can label that dot 3/4. It's always good to put the number above it so that we know exactly what it represents. So now in order to graph the opposite in the negative zone, we have to be very careful where we put our dots. So from the 0, this line would represent a half of a pizza. This line would represent a whole pizza. We don't quite have a whole, but we also don't have a half. We have in between there. So I'm going to put my dot in between a half and a whole. And then I will label that -3/4. So that is what we do when we graph fraction and its opposite on a number line. Then question B is doing the same thing, but with a decimal. The decimal they give us is a negative this time. So we have -1.6. So we're going to be graphing on our number line -1.6 as well as a +1.6. So again, let's start with a number line. I'm going to do another horizontal number line. Let's make a mark that would represent 0. And since we're dealing with decimals, I am not going to have each line be worth a whole. So I'm going to do the same thing we did before. I'm going to have this be a half, then 1 whole, 1.5, and 2 wholes. Same thing in the negatives. We have -1/2, -1 whole, -1.5, -2 wholes. So if we want to start out with -1.6, I always put my pencil on the 0 to start with. I'm going to go to the left since it's a negative number. Negative 1.6 needs to be farther than the negative 1. So here's negative 1. Here's negative 2. If I want negative 1.6, it's going to be in between there. Now, I have a negative 1.5 sitting here. 0.6 is going to be just a little bit more than 0.5. So here's 0.5. That would be a half. If I go a little bit further than that, that's going to be my negative 1.6. So I'll make a little dot sitting there, and I'll label it negative 1.6. Now we're going to have to plot positive 1.6. Here's positive 1. Here's positive 1.5 or 1.5. Positive 1.6 would just be a little bit farther than that on the number line. So we have positive 1.6 sitting there. If I were you, I'd pause the video now and get some practice graphing some other fractions and decimals on the middle of page 262. Okay, so to go over the answers here is a little difficult since I can't just show you the pictures in the answer key. So I can tell you kind of where they're located on the number line. So if you try it out on your own number 1, you should have a dot on the right at 2.5. So the right of the 0, that's all the way to the right. And then on the left of the 0 at 2.5, negative 2.5. Number 2, you should have a dot to the left of the 0 at negative 4/5, and then a dot to the right of the 0 at positive 4/5. Number 3, you should have a dot to the left of the 0 at negative 3.5, and then to the right of the 0 at positive 3.5. Number 4, you should have a dot on the right of the 0 at positive 5.25, and then another one on the left of the 0 at negative 5.25. Kind of difficult to explain those, but that's what they should look like. Next, move on to example 2. Bottom of page 262. We're comparing fractions and mixed numbers this time. So question A says compare negative 1/2 and negative 3/4. So remember those compare symbols from lesson 2. We're going to be using the less than, greater than, or equal to symbols. So they want us to compare negative 1/2 and negative 3/4. So we're trying to figure out which one's bigger and smaller. It's always a great idea to plot them on a number line before you make your decision. So if I'm going to see both these numbers in negatives, I'm going to put my 0 here because I'm going to have all my dots to the left of the 0. So if I were plotting negatives on this side, negative 1/2, and then negative 1 whole, negative 1.5, negative 2 wholes. Negative 1/2 would be sitting right here if I had a half of a pizza. If I had negative 3/4 of a pizza, that's going to be a little bit farther down here. So that's going to be kind of in this area. So remember, when we're trying to figure out which one's bigger and which one's smaller, if the number is closer to the right or closer this way, it's going to be bigger. So our negative 3/4 is smaller than negative 1/2. So when I'm putting in my sign between these two items, negative 1/2 is going to be farther to the right, so it is a greater number than negative 3/4. Even though the numbers and the fractions look bigger, because these negative signs are on them, the negative 1/2 is actually a bigger number than negative 3/4. Item B says compare negative 4 and 5/6 to negative 4 and 1/6. So again, we're comparing. We have negative 4 and 5/6 and negative 4 and 1/6. So again, drawing where they're at on a number line may help you a little bit. So again, we're going with the negative, so I'm going to go ahead and put my 0 here. Here would be negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5. So negative 4 wholes would be sitting right here. This first number says negative 4 and 5/6. That means it's almost another whole. So my dot's going to be almost to the negative 5. About right there. So negative 4 and 5/6. If negative 4 and 1/6 is also between these two, 1/6 is going to be farther to the right because it's closer to the whole number of -4. So my dot would be closer here for that second one. So because the -4 and 5/6 is farther to the right, that one is going to be less than -4 and 1/6. So here are my symbols. -4 and 5/6 is farther to the left, so it is less than -4 and 1/6. Okay, moving on to example 3. Switch colors again. And we're looking at the top of page 263 if you're following along in your book. These ones are comparing decimals now. So again, we're going to use those less than, equal to, and greater than symbols, but we're doing it with decimals. So compare -3.08 and -3.8. There are some definite similarities between these numbers, but there are some major differences. So when we plot these, you'll see how major those differences are. Both numbers are in the negatives, so I'm going to put my 0 on my number line way over here. And then I'm going to go ahead and label my tick marks this time using decimals, since that's what my numbers up here are using. So let's go, this one can be -0.5, -1, -1.5, -2, -2.5, -3, -3.5, -4, and that's how we can number these. So let's take a look and see where these items would be. -3.08. I'm going to underline the 0.8 because this means that there's no number in the tenths column. So this is very, very close to the -3. It's a little bit farther down than the -3. So we're going to go -3 and just a tiny bit more. We don't have a 1 here yet, so it's kind of like having $3.08. It's really close to that 3. So that's -3.08. Now let's figure out where the -3.8 would go. Here's -3, -3.5, -3.8 is going to be a little farther down, -3.8. So again, remember, when you're dealing with negatives, the one farthest to the left is lower, farthest to the right is greater. So if I'm going to put my symbol in between my two numbers, -3.08 is farther to the right, so it is greater than -3.8. And that takes us to our last example. This one is a real-life application question, trying to take these negatives and comparing them into a real-life situation. So it says on page 263, a Chinook wind is a warm mountain wind that can cause rapid temperature changes. The table shows 3 of the greatest temperature drops ever recorded after a Chinook wind occurred. On which date did the temperature drop the fastest? And explain. So if we're taking a look at our little picture there, it kind of gives us an idea of what these Chinook winds do. But the most important thing is that little chart. It gives us 3 fractional degrees in Fahrenheit, and we basically are being asked which one of those is dropping quickest. So we want to know which one is the quickest drop. This first one they give us is a drop of -3 1/10 degrees. And I'm going to put a drop next to that. That's the drop. And it's going down 3 1/10 degrees per minute. So it's going down 3 1/10 per minute. The next drop they record is a -5/8 degrees Fahrenheit per minute. And I'll flip to a new page here since I'm kind of running out of space. And the last one says it's a -2 1/5 degrees Fahrenheit drop per minute. So what we're trying to do is figure out which one of these is going to be the farthest drop? Now, when we see the word drop, I want us to think negative. So when we're thinking drop, we want to think the farthest to the left on our number line. So here's our number line. Since all three are negatives, let's start with a 0 over here and let's label them by halves. So I'm going to go negative, negative a half, negative 1 whole, negative 1.5. Whoa, let's redo that. Got a little messy there. Negative 1.5, a negative 2, negative 2.5, negative 3, negative 3.5, negative 4, and we can stop there since our numbers don't go any lower than that. So where would negative 3 1/10 be? Well, here's negative 3, here's negative 3.5, negative 3 1/10 is going to be closer to the negative 3, so there's negative 3 1/10. Let's do our next one, negative 5/8. Well, that's not quite a whole yet, so let's think about where that would be. So here's negative 1 whole, here's negative 1/2. 1/2 would be 4/8. It's a little bit more than that, so we're going to go a tiny bit more than the negative 1/2 and label it negative 5/8. And lastly, we have negative 2 1/5. From the 0, here's negative 2, here's negative 2.5. 1/5 is a little bit to the right of 1/2, so we're going to go negative 2 1/5 sitting here. So if we're looking for the farthest one to the left, we're going to be looking at this guy. That's going to be the one that's going to drop the fastest. So that's going to be the measurement. If we look at the chart on January 10th, the fastest drop, or the one farthest to the left, is negative 3 1/10 degree Fahrenheit. And that would be our final answer there. So you can pause the video and try the bottom on your own on page 263. So if you tried those, number 5 should be the less than symbol, mouth opening towards the right. Number 6 should be the greater than symbol, the mouth opening towards the left. Number 7 is the less than symbol, the mouth opening towards the right. And for number 8, the answer, a temperature change of negative 3 2/5 degrees Fahrenheit per minute is the farthest to the left on the number line. So the temperature dropped fastest on that day, the negative 3 2/5. And that is the end of this lesson.